going to break my own rule and sit. I'm going to read a story now, just by myself, straight out of the book. William Sidney Porter became O. Henry right here in Columbus, Ohio. And Thurber wrote a story about it. I would like to read from the Thurber album. It's a Thurber album, a new collection of pieces about people. And there's a section in the back called Loose Leaves, Small Stories. And one of those is an O. Henry mystery. Obviously, it's about O. Henry, but it's also about Billy Ireland. And having worked with the special collections here, the Ireland collection and the Thurber collection, the artwork, this story, I selected this story because for me it sort of binds together some of the loose leaves in my life. So here's an O. Henry mystery. Not long after Billy Ireland got to Columbus in 1899, he met a doctor named John M. Thomas. They were both young and unmarried. Billy was not yet 20, and they lived at a boarding house at 383 Oak Street. Dr. Thomas had been appointed physician at the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus through the efforts of a young state representative from Marion named Warren G. Harding. One evening in 1899 or 1900, the years since then have worn the story smooth like a legend and obscured some of the dates and facts. Dr. Thomas brought home a great many manuscripts that had been written by William Sidney Porter, who was then a prisoner in the penitentiary. The manuscripts, which were in longhand, mysteriously disappeared and were never found. Billy Ireland took the blame because they had been in his possession last. Dr. Thomas had given them to Billy to read, and the cartoonist had put them on a table in his room. Somebody, possibly a maid who wanted to dust the table, placed them on a washstand one day, and they were never seen again. The tale has its various versions. One holds that Billy had not had time to read the manuscripts. Another tells that he did read them and recognized their merit. And there is an odd, persistent rumor that he deliberately threw the stories in the wastebasket because Dr. Thomas had told him that O. Henry didn't want them back. Still another variant of the tale has it that the manuscripts, 10 inches high, were taken out and burned by the landlady after she got tired of seeing them around day after day. All that remains now is speculation, since the principal figures in the case are dead. My own conjectures are based on passages here and there in Professor C. Alfonso Smith's O. Henry biography, published in 1916, a curiously vague and old-fashioned book. Dr. Thomas comes into the book in several places, but Billy Ireland is not mentioned anywhere. Porter, variously known as Will, Bill, and Sidney, had entered the penitentiary on April 25, 1898, and was released on January 24, 1901. He had been convicted of embezzling a little more than $1,000 from a Texas bank. Few people believed he was guilty then, and almost nobody believes it now. The record of his literary output during the 33 months of his confinement is incomplete, partly owing to his own failure to keep a detailed account of what he wrote there. It wasn't until October 1, 1900, 2 years and a half after he came to the penitentiary, that Porter began to enter in a notebook the titles of stories he had written there. Only 10 were listed. He unaccountably left out Whistling Dick's Christmas Stocking and George's Ruling, both of which were sold and published during what Professor Smith calls the shadowed years. How many others he may have left out is anybody's guess. On April 5, 1899, Porter wrote a letter to Mrs. G.P. Roach, his mother-in-law, that ended, "I have abundant leisure time at night and I have been putting it to best advantage, studying and accumulating manuscript to use later. He never explained in subsequent letters what he meant by manuscript. Porter had been writing for more than a decade before he was sent up. In 1887, he began to turn out a large volume of jokes, squibs, paragraphs, verses, vignettes, and sketches. Some of these were bought for a pittance by the Detroit Free Press and a magazine in New York called Truth. A magazine in New York called Truth paid him $6 for one or two sketches. In 1897, he sold a short story to McClure's called The Miracle of Lava Canyon, the first one ever published. The editors of the magazine rejected some other stories of his at the same time. Nobody knows how many or what happened to them. As for his penitentiary stories, Dr. Thomas informed Professor Smith that Porter wrote quite a number, whatever that means. The doctor often found one in his desk in the morning, and he told Professor Smith that Porter had asked him to read his stories before sending them out to a magazine. Nobody at the penitentiary could give Professor Smith an accurate estimate of the volume of Porter's pieces. It is not even known for sure whether the most famous story, O. Henry story, a retrieved Reformation. Now, this was written in 1952. If you ask what is the most popular or well-known O. Henry story, anyone want to make a guess?
Gift of the Magi.
Yeah, everyone thinks of The Gift of the Magi. So it wasn't at that time. It was written at the penitentiary, but one prison official, the late George W. Willard, thought that it may have been sketched out there. This story, based, according to Dr. Willard, on the career of a safecracker named Jimmy Connors, a fellow prisoner of Porter's, later inspired Paul Armstrong's hit melodrama, Alias Jimmy Valentine. Now I'm going to skip a little bit here and just move on. Will Porter was a notoriously closed-mouthed man. Even his friends knew very little about him. One of them, Robert H. Davis, who collaborated with Arthur B. Maurice in 1931 on a study of O. Henry called The Caliph of Baghdad, wrote in that book, he had a genius for taciturnity and a profound admiration for silence. Even the editors of McClure's didn't learn until years later that O. Henry had been in prison, in the penitentiary. His stories had been sent out to a friend in New Orleans and remailed from there. His genius for secrecy explains why he never told anybody about the strange case of the vanishing manuscripts that Dr. Thomas took home that night more than 50 years ago. In 1903, he sold a retrieved Reformation to Cosmopolitan, but it wasn't until 1908 that he brought out his book of short stories called The Gentle Grafter. This book, Professor Smith wrote, found its inspiration in the stories told to O. Henry from 1898 to 1901. The first 11 stories in this book had not before been published. They probably belong, as do some of the stories in Cabbages and Kings, to the accumulation of manuscript mentioned by O. Henry in his letter to Mrs. Roach. These 11 stories may have been among the ones that disappeared, and O. Henry may have rewritten them later from memory. It is reasonable to surmise that an author might postpone the tedious task of rewriting stories he had already done before. Certainly he didn't put off the 11 prison pieces because of a fallow period. In 1904 and 1905, he wrote a total of 115 short stories. Dr. Thomas told Professor Smith that Porter could turn out a story in from 1 to 3 hours, and such a prodigious writer might get over the loss of even a stack of manuscripts 10 inches high. Perhaps they were rejections anyway. Since he could get the professional opinion of America's leading magazine editors, I can think of no reason for his asking the advice of a young doctor and a young cartoonist on stories that he hadn't submitted to magazines. Will Porter was a humorist, one of the best America has produced. and such a man is likely to be careless about preserving original manuscripts. The Caliph of Baghdad, Bob Davis wrote, slipped through his little old Baghdad on the subway, leaving but few tangible souvenirs of his reign. How many of the tales that were born of O. Henry exist in the original? Not a dozen, I should say. We have various letters, a sheaf of penciled pages, some sketches, numberless endorsed checks, and some touching appeals to hurry up with the cash. Sounds like Shakespeare. But in comparison with the great mass he turned out in typewritten and longhand manuscripts, nothing. Billy Ireland never mentioned the lost stories of O. Henry to me, although I knew him pretty well when I was a reporter on the Columbus Dispatch in the early 20s. By that time, he had probably got tired of talking about the incident. Behind the high stone walls of the old gray building on West Spring Street, where Will Porter spent 1,005 nights, his name has probably been forgotten. One of the few certainties about his life there is that he invented his famous pseudonym while acting as night clerk of the prison pharmacy. There are several theories as to where he got the name. He had seen it in a New Orleans newspaper. He had come upon it in a French medical book. He got it from the actual name of the captain of the guard at the penitentiary. This last seems to be the most likely explanation. The captain of the guard was a man named Orrin Henry. The faint trail of William Sidney Porter in and out of Columbus, Ohio, has long grown cold. I leave the mystery of the missing manuscripts of O. Henry to a younger and more active researcher, but I warn him that the task is hard and that it may even be impossible. O. Henry had no conscientious Boswell, wrote Davis and Maurice, no faithful Forster. Therefore, O. Henriana today is largely a matter of memory, more or less shadowy, and often conflicting. O. Henry lingered here a little season, left a few blurred fingerprints, and quietly departed. Most of the things he touched are lost, but his best work has not been forgotten, and it won't be.